So, let's take a look at ancient Egypt. We looked a little bit last time at some of the geography, and I did mention that Herodotus, remember we have the Herodotus Society. Well, here he comes up. He's a Greek historian, 5th century BC, but he writes that Egypt is the gift of the Nile. And I think that's true. Without the Nile, there would be no Egypt. And I showed you some stuff last time. Here's a picture that I took out the window of a plane when I took students there. I've taken students to Egypt probably 4 times. I don't know. Something like that. 3 or 4 times. One time I had a group and we were in Luxor in the south. And we're flying back to Cairo. And they put us on a plane. It was like a little jet. It was like we were almost the only ones on there, like 3 other people besides our group. It was really very strange. And we were banking away from the airport at Luxor, and I looked out the window, so it's a little bit hazy, and I saw the Nile, and I took this picture. Because it illustrates that the Nile is a source of life. You can see the green on either side, and then it goes right to desert. In fact, there are places, many places, where you can have 1 foot on the sand and 1 foot in the green. And most of the people of ancient Egypt live along the Nile. Both in ancient times and in modern times, people live along the Nile. And as we mentioned previously, the Nile is the longest river in the world. I think I mentioned that last time, but it is anyway. I'll mention it again. And it flows from south to north, which, a lot of times when we think about rivers, we think about them going north to south, basically, because the ones that we encounter tend to do that in Europe and North America. But this one, south to north. Why do I point that out? For a couple of reasons. First of all, it really helps us understand the geography. Secondly, the Egyptians divided their land not north-south, but upriver, downriver. When we think about things being upriver, we tend to think of up as being north and down as being south. When we look at maps, that's the way we orient maps. North is up. But for the Egyptians, up was south. Does that make sense? So they divided their world into Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt. And Upper Egypt is south of Lower Egypt. So however you can understand that or remember that, that would be good. Because that's going to come up many times during the semester. The sources of the Nile. The Nile, of course, is flowing through the Sahara Desert and through desert land all the way to the Mediterranean. So where does all this water come from? It's coming from sub-Saharan Africa. It's coming from Lake Victoria in places like Zaire and Zimbabwe and Ethiopia, and it's flowing out of the mountains of Africa. There are 2 main sources. There is the White Nile and the Blue Nile, and they join together to form the Nile. Okay, so that's way upstream from where we're going to be talking about, but it's important to know that's where it begins. So here again is a satellite kind of image that you can see. And if you look carefully here towards the bottom of the map, you can see the White Nile and the Blue Nile coming together. And you can see the mountains that are way down there in the south. So what you see here is the Mediterranean to the north, the Red Sea, which divides, it forks around this peninsula, which is the Sinai Peninsula. Of course, the Sinai, famous for Moses, right? In fact, the traditional site for Mount Sinai is right about there near the tip of the Sinai Peninsula, way up on a mountain. I climbed up that mountain once. few years back. And it's very rugged territory and very dry. Okay? I'll talk more about it probably later. But you can also see the branches of the Nile coming together here. Notice how it curves around and heads on north. As we mentioned last time, you can predominantly see here the delta, a triangle shape area, which looks like the capital Greek letter delta, right, upside down. And this was what the Greeks ended up naming it, and of course it now names all areas where rivers run into salt water, freshwater rivers running into salt water, deposit whatever sediment they're taking because of the density change in the water, and it creates a delta, like the Mississippi Delta, that sort of thing. Okay? So that's it. That's the general geography. But you see, surrounded by desert. So Egypt then had a good barrier on this side to the west, the Sahara. They had a barrier to the east, which was more desert, right? And then you have the Arabian Desert over here. So not too much activity coming this way. From the south, there are a series of cataracts, which are what they're called, but they are rapids, granite outcrops, which make it difficult to, say, put a boat in way down south and just float right on up here. You're going to have to deal with those rapids. So that's a good barrier from the south. And so to the north and to the northeast is where most of the traffic and invasions and warfare and conflict comes. From the sea, at times, and then the Egyptians will go across the north of the Sinai Peninsula, up into Palestine, on into Syria, well, today would be Turkey, fighting battles and dealing with people coming from those directions, people from Mesopotamia later on. Here's a more traditional map of ancient Egypt with the labels on there instead of a satellite image. You can see two of the cataracts listed, two of the six. This is mostly the extent of ancient Egypt would go to about the second cataract, although at times they will move on up further up to the south along the Nile and control the area of Nubia, which you see is down here. Nubia. And the people who lived there called Nubians. This is mentioned in the Bible, right? In fact, one of Moses' wife was a Nubian. Believe it or not, she was. I think, look it up, you'll find it. There's Mount Sinai, predominantly listed, the traditional site for it right there. The Gulf of Suez, the Gulf of Aqaba, or if you're in Israel, they call it the Gulf of Eilat. The Dead Sea, Palestine, the Nile Delta. Other things, I guess, while we're here, is to point out Thebes and Luxor. Across the river is the Valley of the Kings. Memphis is the capital in the Old Kingdom. And here are the pyramids. Here's the modern capital of Cairo. And we should mention Akhenaten or Tel El Amarna, which was the capital during the New Kingdom for a short time. And we'll talk about that as well. Okay, any questions about that? Just a little bit about the geography. Now the other thing to remember is, remember I told you about the labels Lower and Upper Egypt. So this is why it's important to remember the Nile flows from the south to the north. If you're going upstream, you're going to Upper Egypt. These are labels that the ancient Egyptians used themselves, Lower and Upper Egypt. And so Egyptologists use them, historians use them now. You're going to run into it a lot in your reading. You'll run into it a lot, anything that deals with ancient Egypt. So you just need to keep that in mind and find a way to remember it. There's the first cataract, the second cataract. As I mentioned, these are granite outcrop barriers, rapids, if you will, along the Nile. So that sets the geographic boundaries. The Nile itself has these cataracts. Like I said, about 6 of them. And the Nile is not only a source of water, which therefore means it's a source ultimately of food, but it's also a means of transportation. The Egyptians could sail on the Nile. And they had boats probably somewhat similar to this one. This is a modern one. I took this picture several years ago now. It's called a felucca. The felucca, you might think of it like these guys on here are using it sort of like a taxi, a water taxi, if you will, to get from one side of the Nile to the other. This is in Cairo. It's a huge city, very busy. So this guy just goes back and forth across the Nile, charging people a small amount on either side, and that keeps his boat going, pays for his food and so forth. If you go as a tourist and you want to go out in one of these boats, which I've done, the guy will charge you a lot more. But he won't pack it full of a bunch of other people, so that's a plus. And he'll do kind of a little loop and bring you right back. So you don't want to cross because you're not really using it for that purpose. So he'll do like a little loop around, let you take your pictures, and then come back, so you can say you were on the Nile. So there you go. But I put this here because notice it has a sail. Remember, the flow goes from south to north. So if you just put a boat out there and let the current carry you, eventually you'll flow out to the Mediterranean. But the prevalent winds, if you use a sail, will actually take you upstream. I don't know how many of you are sailors. Well, there's a little tricks to it, but you can maneuver pretty well by a sail up. Now, of course, when the wind dies, you got to use oars. Do it that way. Okay. So keep that in mind. It helps in navigation. And Egypt was a very, very long but very narrow kingdom. So transportation, communication is a real issue. And the Nile is the way they're going to address it. Now, the other thing to remember are the floods. You got the cataracts, which slow people down coming from the south, but then you have floods. I don't know how many of you have ever been in a flood. Hopefully none of you have. If it was it a river flood or?
On my street.
Your street, yeah. When rivers, it's amazing how far water will reach. You'll think, well, that's too far from the water source. Of course, around here in Florida, we're, like the highest spot is like 4 inches above sea level. So, I exaggerate, but not much. So yeah, all of us are in a flood-prone area. It's called Florida, right? Pretty much the whole thing could flood. But here we're mostly getting ocean flooding, from hurricanes, storm surge, that kind of stuff. I'm talking about rivers, streams flooding. They can really flood too. Now, when a river or stream floods, like the Nile, it brings with it a lot of silt. One of the things you will notice if you ever experience a kind of flood is a kind of really fine, silty, dark, organic stuff that gets in everything. If it gets in your house, it gets in the rugs, the carpet, the furniture. That's why pretty much you have to throw everything out. Can get in the walls, But if you live in ancient Egypt and you know when the floods happen, the thing about the floods of the ancient Nile is that it was very predictable, and it was it's a regular and predictable thing. So I don't know how many of you are farmers, but I can tell you this: you don't want to plant and then have a flood. That's usually not a good pattern, right? Because usually what happens then is that the seeds that you plant tend to rot. It wrecks it. So what the Egyptians would do is they would wait until after the flood to plant. Makes sense, right? You don't want to plant before. It's a lot of work to plant. And it takes your seeds, which is stuff you could be eating, you're planting it in the ground, and you don't want to waste that either. So they'd wait till after the annual flood, and then they would plant. As another benefit of the flood, Not only would it sort of water the ground, moisten it, but it left behind that layer of organic material, which is very fertile soil, kind of fertilize the soil as well as water the soil, and then you plant. In fact, the Egyptians kept track of the flooding. They had something called a Nilometer. A Nilometer. Not a speedometer, but a Nilometer. This is a meter, a measuring of the Nile, and they had it in different places. Sometimes it sort of looks like steps that go down to the river, and the steps are a measured distance, and then as it comes up, you can use that to measure. I don't know if you've lived near rivers. I used to live near the Ohio River, and at about every town, every bridge would have measurements on the bridge, measurements near the bridge. And a lot of those towns along the Ohio have flood walls, so that they can close the flood walls when they know the water is upstream, is coming down at a high level, to try to protect the town. And they will often paint, here's the highest level the water ever was, that kind of thing. That's sort of what the Nilometer was. It was a way of measuring it. They would go upstream, upper Nile, and they would measure the height of the Nile, and they knew from experience that if the Nile is, let's say, 10 feet above where it is normally at this town on this day, we're going to send a message quickly downstream, and people will be able to calculate when that surge of water will be to them. Does that make sense? Because that's what would happen. The water kind of surges down, and as it moves down, then it'll lower down here, but it'll keep moving on downstream. This way you can prepare. You can make preparations for the flood, and you could predict within a few days when it's going to be there. And then after it moves on downstream, you can go ahead and clean up, plant, that sort of thing. Does that make sense? So this also means that Egypt becomes very important in the ancient world because it is a place of food. Some have called it the bread basket of the ancient world. Can you think of any occasions when that has entered into anything you know about Egypt? You might think about this book you might have heard of. It's called the Bible. You ever heard of the Bible? The Old Testament.
Story of Joseph.
The story of Joseph. What happens in the story of Joseph?
There was God gave Joseph a vision and dream that there would be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine.
Right.
So they stockpiled during the 7 years of plenty so that they could give to the rest of the world.
And
To the rest of the world.
And when his brothers come and see him again after what happens, why are they coming to Egypt? For food. Yes. They're coming there because there's been a drought in Palestine and Israel, and they're coming because Egypt never has that happen. They always have food. Why? Because they have the Nile. They can irrigate the fields, and they always have food. So this is in ancient times. It's back to Joseph, back to the patriarchal period, right on up to the Roman period. The Romans hauled a lot of grain out of Egypt to help feed the Roman Empire. So, remember, however you can remember it, northern Egypt is lower Egypt and it's downstream. Southern Egypt is upper Egypt and it's upstream. It's upstream.
It's basically like the opposite of what you think.
Yes, it's the opposite of what you would think. So if you look at a map and you say, okay, up is north, when we say up, when we're dealing about Egypt, we're going south. That's why I belabor it, because I've had people on tests, and even people get very confused because they read in the book, you're talking about Upper Egypt, and they think you're talking about up by the Mediterranean, up in the Delta region. And I have to say, no, it's way far south of there. Well, okay, we'll end it there for today. Keep watching MyFire for updates.